Apartheid is a term that carries heavy historical weight, symbolizing a brutal system of racial segregation and discrimination in South Africa. The word apartheid is derived from Afrikaans, meaning apartness or separateness. But how did this system of racial oppression come into existence, and what were its roots? Let's dive into the history that led to one of the most infamous periods in modern history. The roots of racial inequality in South Africa stretch back to the early days of European colonization. In 1652, the Dutch East India Company established a trading post at the Cape of Good Hope. This marked the beginning of the Dutch Cape Colony, which rapidly expanded as European settlers displaced the indigenous Khoikhoi people. The settlers established farms, and to work these lands, they imported black slaves from other parts of the Dutch Empire. By the late 18th century, the control over the African population intensified. In 1797, local officials in Swellendam and Graafrenet extended past laws, originally meant for slaves, to include the Khoikhoi people. These passes restricted their movement, binding them to the will of European settlers. The British, who later took control of the Cape Colony, expanded these laws, further tightening the noose around the local African population. The British Empire annexed the Dutch Cape Colony during the Napoleonic Wars, leading to the introduction of new laws that further entrenched racial segregation. The 1833 Slavery Abolition Act, although freeing slaves, led to the creation of an indentured labor system that kept many black South Africans in a state of virtual slavery. As the century progressed, new laws limited the freedom of black workers and codified racial inequality. The discovery of diamonds and gold in South Africa in the late 19th century only deepened racial divisions. The demand for cheap labor in the mines and industrial centers led to harsher restrictions on black workers. Legislation such as the Franchise and Ballot Act of 1892 and the Glenn Gray Act of 1894 systematically disenfranchised non-white South Africans, ensuring that wealth and political power remained in the hands of the white minority. As the 20th century dawned, South Africa's racial laws became even more entrenched. The Union of South Africa, established in 1910, saw the consolidation of white political power and the systematic exclusion of black people from political life. The Native Land Act of 1913 and subsequent legislation restricted black ownership of land and enforced residential segregation. The real turning point came in 1948, when the National Party won the South African general election on a platform of strict racial segregation. The party, driven by Afrikaner nationalism, sought to institutionalize a system where whites would have absolute control over the political and economic spheres, while black South Africans were relegated to designated areas and denied basic rights. This policy, known as apartheid, was designed to keep the races separate in every aspect of life. Within the National Party, there were different views on how apartheid should be implemented. The dominant faction, known as Baskap, white domination, favored maintaining black participation in the economy under strict control. Another faction, the Purists, advocated for complete separation, envisioning a South Africa where blacks would live in their own regions with separate political systems. Hendrik Verwoerd, a key figure in the National Party, would later become a leading architect of apartheid, pushing for policies that combined segregation with economic exploitation. Apartheid in South Africa wasn't just a series of random acts of discrimination, it was a carefully designed system that categorized people by race and dictated every aspect of their lives. The National Party, NP, argued that South Africa wasn't one nation but rather four distinct racial groups: whites, blacks, coloreds, and Indians. These groups were further divided into 13 nations, or racial federations. White people were split into English and Afrikaans speakers, while the black population was divided into 10 groups. The NP government passed laws that laid the groundwork for what became known as Grand Apartheid, a policy aimed at large-scale racial separation. This policy forced people to live in areas designated by race, a strategy that was partially borrowed from the British colonial rule that had separated different racial groups in the Boer republics after the Anglo-Boer War. This led to the creation of black-only townships or locations, where black South Africans were relocated. Hendrik Verwoerd, who became the Minister of Native Affairs in 1950, played a pivotal role in crafting these laws. He earned the title Architect of Apartheid due to his significant contributions to the system. The first major law under Grand Apartheid was the Population Registration Act of 1950. This law required everyone over the age of 18 to carry an identity card that specified their racial group. Teams of officials were set up to determine the race of people whose racial identity wasn't clear. This process often led to the separation of families, especially among colored people. Next came the Group Areas Act of 1950, which ended racially diverse neighborhoods. From then on, people had to live in areas assigned to their race. This act laid the foundation for forced removals in later years. Other laws, such as the Prevention of Illegal Squatting Act of 1951 and the Native Laws Amendment Act of 1952, further restricted where black people could live and work. Apartheid was not just about grand strategies, it also infiltrated the daily lives of South Africans through petty apartheid laws. The Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act of 1949 made marriages between different races illegal, and the Immorality Act of 1950 criminalized sexual relationships between whites and non-whites. The Reservation of Separate Amenities Act of 1953 allowed municipalities to reserve public spaces for specific races. This led to the creation of separate beaches, buses, hospitals, schools, and universities. Signs reading "Whites Only" became common, even on park benches. The services provided to black South Africans were significantly inferior to those available to whites and, to a lesser extent, to colored and Indian people. To maintain its grip on power, the apartheid government passed laws aimed at crushing any resistance. The Suppression of Communism Act of 1950 was one such law, banning the Communist Party of South Africa and any party that supported communism. The law was broad and vague, allowing the government to label anyone opposing apartheid as a communist. This law was used extensively to arrest and ban leaders of groups like the African National Congress, ANC, the South African Indian Congress, SAIC, and the South African Congress of Trade Unions, SACTU. The government also enacted the Bantu Authorities Act of 1951, which created separate government structures for blacks and whites, laying the groundwork for the Homelands Policy. Education was another area where apartheid's influence was deeply felt. The Bantu Education Act of 1953 established a separate, inferior education system for black South Africans, focusing on African culture and vocational training rather than academic achievement. The Promotion of Black Self-Government Act of 1959 further entrenched apartheid by creating self-governing Bantu units, which were intended to develop into independent homelands. The Black Homeland Citizenship Act of 1970 marked a new phase in this strategy, changing the status of blacks to citizens of one of 10 autonomous territories. The goal was to ensure that white people remained the majority in South Africa by making these Bantustans fully independent. Voting rights were another battleground in the apartheid struggle. The Separate Representation of Voters Act of 1951 initially targeted colored voters, moving them to a separate voters' roll. This was challenged in court, leading to a series of legal battles. In 1956, the government finally succeeded in passing the act, effectively removing colored voters from the common voters' roll. By 1969, even the limited representation for colored voters was abolished, leaving whites as the only enfranchised group. Indians, who had never been allowed to vote, were also excluded. The Colored Persons Representative Council, created in 1968, was a token gesture with limited legislative power and was eventually dissolved in 1980. Even among white South Africans, apartheid was a divisive issue. Before South Africa became a republic in 1961, there was a significant divide between the conservative, pro-republic Afrikaners and the liberal, anti-republic English speakers. The legacy of the Boer War played a role in this division, with many English speakers remaining loyal to the British Crown. However, as decolonization swept across Africa, some English-speaking South Africans began to support apartheid, fearing for their safety. Prime Minister Hendrik Verwoerd attempted to unify whites under the banner of apartheid, but the divide remained, with many English speakers remaining apathetic or opposed to the policy. Apartheid was more than just a policy, it was a comprehensive system designed to divide and control. Through a combination of grand apartheid laws, petty apartheid regulations, and a relentless suppression of opposition, the South African government sought to maintain white dominance at all costs. The effects of these policies are still felt today, serving as a stark reminder of the dangers of institutionalized racism. Apartheid, the harsh system of racial segregation in South Africa, wasn't born out of thin air. The concept of dividing people based on race had existed long before, dating back to the 19th century when the British created reserves for black South Africans. However, under apartheid, this separation became extreme. Only 13% of the land was set aside for black homelands, areas designated for black populations. These lands were typically barren and lacked the resources to sustain the people forced to live there. This so-called homeland system was further cemented by the Tomlinson Commission of 1954, which supported apartheid but recommended more land be allocated to the homelands. The government ignored this recommendation. When Hendrik Verwoerd became Prime Minister in 1958, he introduced the policy of separate development. This policy envisioned South Africa as a nation divided into multiple ethnostates, with each homeland supposedly becoming an independent nation. The government framed this policy as one of differentiation, not discrimination, claiming it allowed each nation self-determination within its borders. However, the reality was far from this idealized vision. Under this policy, black South Africans were stripped of their citizenship, becoming citizens of their homelands instead. This meant they were no longer recognized as South Africans and were treated as foreign laborers, working in South Africa on temporary permits. The Promotion of Black Self-Government Act of 1958 established this system, forcing many black South Africans, who had never even lived in these homelands, to move there. Verwoerd's vision led to the creation of 20 homelands, 19 for black South Africans and 1, Basterland, for a colored subgroup. 4 of these homelands, Transkei, Bophuthatswana, Venda, and Ciskei, were declared independent by the South African government, but this independence was merely a facade. These homelands had no real economic infrastructure and were composed of disconnected territories, making them little more than puppet states under South African control. Despite the government's efforts to gain international recognition for these homelands, South Africa remained the only country to acknowledge their independence. Even within South Africa, the homeland system was widely criticized and seen as a blatant attempt to justify the apartheid regime. The apartheid government's vision of separate development wasn't just a political strategy, it had devastating human consequences. Millions of black South Africans were forcibly removed from their homes and relocated to these homelands. This included people living in urban areas, labor tenants on white-owned farms, and residents of black spots surrounded by white farms. These removals were often violent and traumatic. One of the most notorious examples was the removal of 60,000 residents from Sophia Town, a vibrant black neighborhood in Johannesburg, in 1955. Despite widespread protests, the government bulldozed the area and built a white suburb, Triumph, in its place. This pattern of forced removals repeated across the country, affecting not only black South Africans but also colored and Indian communities. Apartheid wasn't just about land and citizenship, it permeated every aspect of life. The government passed a series of laws known as petty apartheid to enforce racial segregation in the most mundane aspects of daily life. These laws banned mixed marriages, segregated public facilities, and restricted where people could live, work, and even walk. Black South Africans needed passes to enter white areas, and without them, they risked arrest and deportation. Public services like hospitals, schools, and transportation were segregated, with white facilities receiving far better funding and resources. Even beaches, parks, and graveyards were divided by race. The apartheid government's control extended into education and the economy. Black children received an inferior education designed to prepare them for a life of labor, while white children enjoyed well-funded schools. The Bantu Education Act of 1953 formalized this system, creating separate, substandard schools for black students. Economic opportunities were also heavily restricted. Black South Africans were barred from running businesses in white areas and could only work in certain jobs if they had a pass. Women, particularly black and colored women, faced even greater challenges, often working in low-paying, unstable jobs with little hope of advancement. Despite the overwhelming oppression, black South Africans, along with colored and Indian communities, resisted apartheid at every turn. The establishment of separate universities for different racial groups in 1959 only fueled the resistance, as did the creation of the tricameral parliament in 1983, which granted voting rights to coloreds and Indians but excluded the black majority. The apartheid system also had a profound impact on women, who faced a triple yoke of oppression based on gender, race, and class. Many women worked as domestic servants or in agriculture, earning meager wages and struggling to provide for their families. Despite these hardships, they played a crucial role in the anti-apartheid movement, fighting for their rights and the rights of their communities. The legacy of apartheid continues to shape South Africa today. The deliberate separation of communities, the economic disparities, and the systemic racism have left deep scars on the nation. However, the resilience and courage of those who fought against apartheid have also left a lasting legacy of hope and determination. South Africa's journey towards true equality and justice is far from over, but the lessons of its past continue to guide its future.